Hey everyone. So this is Sumit, or should I call myself as the channel's name? Okay, no worries. Let's get started with the learning. What were we learning? Yeah, React testing, and hopefully we can do some progress on this, like 1 hour, 1 hour or so that I get a better understanding of this. Um, Yeah, so without wasting any time, let's get started with the part two. I'll the reason I'm putting up the camera is to understand better how I'm reacting, and which will help me in interviews as well. So here I am on the camera. Okay, enough of my overacting, and let's get started with this
component. And then finally, we'll take the users list and pass it down into the user list component. Once again, I know this stuff when you kind of speak about it or when you say, hey, here's what we're going to do, sounds a little bit complicated, but this is some pretty straightforward React stuff. So let's just write out the code for this really quickly so we can start to focus on the much more interesting part, which is the testing aspect. Okay, so back inside my editor, I'm going to find the app component that's inside the app.js file. At the very top, let's import use state from React. I'll then define a new piece of state called users and default it to be an empty array. Add it.
So
And I'm going
I guess I've done this like
I'll
in
then
the
pass
last part I coded it
back
myself. So
inside of handle.
I guess we can just skip
The form
over.
is submitted. Let's call on user add and put in as an object. So notice the curly braces right there.
Skip over
And
this
that should be
part.
it. So now we are communicating these newly added users up into the app component. The last thing we have to take care of is actually rendering out the list of users. So inside of our app.js file, at the very top, let's import user list from form and then display as a prop. To do is see the list of separate and we'll use a td users email where we'll display the rendered users.
Okay.
And that's it. I'm going to zoom out on this file so you can see the entire thing. Now, if you got stuck at any point in time, or if I just kind of sped through this too quickly, don't sweat it. I'm going to attach the completed version of this code. Code for this application will be attached to this video. You can just download it and use that code directly. Back over in the browser, I'm going to refresh the page. I should then be able to add in a name of, say, Alex, and alex@gmail.com. Looks good. You'll notice that the name and email inputs do not empty themselves out whenever we add a new user. That's okay for right now. We'll add in a test to make sure that we actually eventually take care of that. I should also be able to add in jane@jane.com. Yeah, all looks good, and I do not see any error messages. So that's it for the simple application. We got the kind of boring part done. Now we can start to focus.
Okay. So I'm done with this. So our first test.
So here's the process we're going to go through, and we're going to repeat this process for each individual component we have put together: the app, the user form, and the user list. In step one, we're going to pick out one component that we want to test all by itself. We're going to first begin by testing the user form component. So that is the form at the very top of the page. Once we picked out that component, we're then going to make a test file for it, if one doesn't already exist. So back inside my src directory, we want to test the user form component, and that's inside of user form.js. So I'm going to make a test file by creating a new file inside the same directory, and I'm going to give it a name of userform.test.js. So here's user form, here's user form test.js. We're going to write out all the tests for the user form component, you guessed it, inside this file. Next up, we're going to take a look at our component, and we're going to decide what the most important aspects or the most important parts of the component are. This part, or this step right here, is where we decide exactly what we want to test about our component. So for the user form, I've come up with what I think are kind of the two most important aspects of this thing. I think the most important aspects are that it shows two inputs, one right here, and one button.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is really important about this is that if we enter in a name and an email, and then click on the submit button, we should call the onUserAdd prop, that callback that is passed into our component. If it doesn't call that callback whenever user submits the form, that means something is not quite right with the component, and we would probably need to figure out what is going wrong. So these are the two important things I think that really exist inside of our component right now. So we're going to try to test both aspects. All right, so step 4, we're going to open up that test file and start to write out our tests. Okay, So back over inside user form test.js, we're going to write out a little bit of code. And again, some of this is going to be a little bit mysterious, but I'm going to make sure it's super clear what it's all about over time in the coming videos. To get started, at the very top, I'm going to import render and screen from to import user from dash event. And then finally, I'm going to import form. I'm then going to define our first test. Remember, we can define a test by calling the built-in test function. This is built into the global environment, so we do not need to import the test function into this file or anything like that. The test function is provided by our test runner, which is Jest. The first argument to the test function is going to be a short description for what we are trying to test. So in this case, we're trying to make sure that the user form shows 2 inputs and a button. So we'll say it shows 2 inputs and a button. Actual testing code. Let's do these steps. So the first thing, put it and render it. We need to produce some HTML that we can somehow work with. In step 2, we're going to manipulate the component or find an element in it, button or something like that. Want it to do. So that might be it successfully calls a callback. Maybe it successfully shows some element on the screen. Maybe it updates itself. It can be any of a wide variety of different things. And over time, that we can make to make sure the component is behaving as we expect. React. We call the render function, and we put in the component that we want to render as JSX, like so. If we want to pass any props to our component when it is rendered, we would pass them in right here. So for example, if we wanted to pass in some, I don't know, name prop or something like that, we can just write it out directly. Now notice that we are rendering just the user form component by itself. So there currently is no app component. There's no concept of a user list. We have isolated just the user form component and we're testing it by itself. Now in step number 2, we're going to either manipulate the component or try to find an element that has been rendered by it. So in this case, we might try to find those 2 user or the 2 text inputs that we've added in and that button as well. And the code for this that we're going to write out to try to find these different elements is going to be a little bit mysterious, but we're going to go into great detail on what it does in just a little bit. So first, I'm going to declare a variable called inputs, and this is going to be screen get all by role, and I'm going to put in text box. We're going to go into detail. First, let's find text space to be in again, document. Just something we're going to go in, and we're going to dive back into this test, understand what's going on with. So to run a test, we're going to open up our run inside of a second. I will then, now if I scroll up the test that we first created our project, we automatically got, and it was just a default. Scroll down to the bottom, we will see that all the tests inside of our user form test file have passed. So that means that we successfully have shown 2 text inputs and 1 button. Very good. Our test is currently using 2 different query functions, get all by role and get by role. I want to help you understand what this role stuff is talking about, because we're going to be making use of these 2. Our first test is all done and passing, and now I want to go over some of the code inside of here and make sure the code just completely makes sense. Okay, so first we'll begin with a little bit of backstory here. What happens when we run our tests? Whenever we run our tests, they are being executed in a Node.js environment. There is no browser like Chrome or Firefox involved. Whenever we render our component by calling that render function, a fake browser environment is being created by a library called JSDOM. Our component is rendered, HTML is taken from it, and is placed into this kind of fake browser environment. So we can imagine that there kind of somewhat is real HTML that we are working with here. After we render our component, we can then access elements that have been placed or rendered in here by using this screen object. And we imported that screen object from the React testing library. So that's what's going on with the render function and the screen object. The next thing I want to focus on are the functions we are using to find individual elements that were rendered by our component. These functions have names like getAllByRole and getByRole. Now, before talking about those functions too much, I just want to point out something that's really important in the process of testing. It is extremely common in just about every single test we ever write out that we're going to render a component and then try to find some elements that our component produced. This is going to happen all the time in almost every test. So for example, if we ever need to test form submission, we need to render our component and then find a button that we can click on. If we want to test navigation, we need to render our component and then find a link element to click. If we want to make sure a header is visible, we need to find a header element. So the point here is that it's extremely common for us to try to render a component and then try to find an element. Query functions are how we are going to find elements that our component has rendered. These query functions, a little bit of bad news here, the query functions can be a little bit tedious to use sometimes. So we're going to introduce them slowly throughout the course because there are many different query functions we're going to eventually use. So here's our first little taste of these query functions, which we use to find elements.
Okay.
These query functions are provided by React Testing Library. In total, there's about 48 different functions or so, and I've got a partial list of them right here. Now, I'm going to tell you right away, you do not need to memorize all of these different functions. We usually use a small subset of them very frequently on individual projects. These different query functions have very similar names. So they are going to have names like get by role, find by role, get by label text, query all by role, find by title, a pretty repetitive name structure. And we're going to see that the names actually have a lot of meaning. Eventually, you will know what function to use without looking at any documentation based upon just the name of the function itself. Okay, so that's where these two functions are coming from. They are being used, or they are part of the query system. We use them to find elements that have been rendered by our component. Now, the query functions we are using in particular of get all by role and get by role, we're going to use these very often, so I want to go into more detail on them in just a moment. Be making use of these two query functions quite a bit throughout the course. Okay, so the word role is referring to something called an ARIA role. ARIA roles clarify the purpose of an HTML element. This is an entire system that's been developed to help people who have disabilities, particularly around vision or eyesight, understand what
accessible. Sorry. Yeah, ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application. Okay.
is visible on the screen of their browser. These ARIA roles are most often used by screen readers. A screen reader is a piece of software that helps people just understand what content is on the screen. Now, many different HTML elements, such as tables and buttons and text inputs, have what is referred to as an implicit role. Implicit is a fancy technical term in this case. What it really means is some elements automatically get assigned a role. We can also manually assign a role to an element. You and I are not going to do this very often. The reason for that is really simple. The ARIA role system is very easy to make mistakes with, and even very highly trained engineers sometimes assign roles incorrectly. So usually if you're not a total expert and you know exactly what you're doing, it's usually best to try to not manually assign roles to an element. So you and I are not going to do manual assignment too often. We're really just going to depend upon the implicit role of different elements. Okay, a little bit more information here. So like I said, many different HTML elements have an automatic or implicit role assigned to them. Here's a partial listing right here. So some elements like H1, H2, H3, and so on all have an ARIA role of heading. That means if you ever display an H1, H2, H3, and so on, and a person with a screen reader selects this element or asks their screen reader software to tell them what this element is doing, the screen reader will say, this is a heading element, and it will tell the user exactly what text is inside that heading.
Okay.
ULs and LIs have a role of list. Buttons, button, anchor elements, link, and an input of type text, or an input without any type attribute assigned to it, is going to have a role of text box. So that's what's going on here with these two function calls. We are saying, go and take a look at the HTML that was produced by our component and find whatever elements were rendered that have a role of text box. That's going to find our two inputs, and find some element that has a role of button. That's going to find our button. Now, this entire role system is the primary or the preferred way of finding elements that have been rendered by our component. React Testing Library really pushes you in this direction. They want you to try to find elements based upon role. This might sound a little bit tedious, because it pretty much means that we need to understand this entire ARIA role system in order to test our components. Well, yes and no. Understanding the role system, you're going to see it gets pretty easy pretty quickly. It's not the trickiest thing in the world. And if you don't want to use roles at all, there's not a great reason not to, but if you don't want to use roles at all, there are many other ways that we can find elements that our component has rendered. So in this course, we're going to be using these roles quite a bit, so you're going to get a lot of practice with them. The last thing I'd like to take a look at around our test are the assertions down here at the bottom. So remember, these are referred to as assertions. They are where we are going to make sure that our component is doing exactly what we expect. In our case, we have two different assertions, one to make sure that we found two different inputs, and one to just make sure that the button we found is actually visible on the screen or present in the document. Whenever we want to make an assertion, we're going to use the expect function. Expect is provided by the Jest testing framework. It is a global variable, so that means we do not need to import it or anything like that. Whenever we call expect, we are always going to pass in some value right here. We're then going to chain on a function that we refer to as a matcher. A matcher is going to take a look at the value we passed in and make sure that some property or attribute of it is equal to maybe something we provide, or just make sure that the value we provided is present in the document or exists, or any of a variety of different checks. There are many different matchers available to us. Once again, you do not need to memorize this full list, but there are several that we're going to focus on throughout the course. The matchers that we have available to us inside of our project and all Create React App projects are coming from both the Jest testing library, and some additional matchers are provided by React Testing Library.
Okay.
The matchers that come from Jest are kind of more general purpose, test just about anything. React components, Node.js code, pretty much any JavaScript. So the matchers coming from Jest are going to have names like to have length, to equal, to contain, to throw, to have been called. You can find a full list of all these different matchers at the link you see right there. The other set of matchers we get access to, again, they're coming from React testing library. Technically, a library called Jest DOM is the one that's providing these extra matchers. You can find a link to the documentation for this right there at the bottom of this diagram. These matchers are going to have names like to be in the document, to be enabled, to have class, to have text content, to have value. All of these matchers are generally concerned with making sure that some DOM element has some particular attribute or is present, has text, and so on. We're going to be using matchers from both these libraries throughout all of our different tests quite a bit. The nice thing about these matchers is that they usually have very plain text names that you can kind of read and very quickly understand what they do. So for example, expect an element to have class. Well, there's really only so many things this could be talking about. Maybe it's talking about a JavaScript class, or in this case, what it's actually talking about is an element having a class name. So you can pretty much very quickly figure out what the different matchers are checking for without even looking at the documentation. Okay, so that's, again, just a little bit on these different matchers. We're going to use a wide variety of different matchers throughout the course, so we're going to get a lot of practice with different ones. All right, I think that's enough around this first test. So we're going to start to work on our next test in just a moment, where we're going to try to enter some text into our form and attempt to submit it.
Okay, testing was not wrapped in act, warning, and test failures. In the upcoming lecture, we will be testing simulated user events. When executing the test, you will see this message in your terminal: warning, an update to the user form inside a test was not wrapped in act. React testing library RTL just saw a major version 14 update a few weeks ago. Create React app has not updated its version of RTL, so there are currently some major conflicts with dependencies that are being installed. Most importantly, user events are now async. Okay, to resolve this error in this project and anywhere else in the course that shows user events like user.click, user.board, you'll need to make the test async. Okay, got it. Then add a wait keyword wherever there is a user action. The act warning appears to be a bug that was introduced in a version 14 RTL React testing library update and then fixed with version 14. You may choose to ignore the warning as they should not affect your test. If you wish to resolve them, you can uninstall the version of RTL. Okay.
The next test we're going to add around our form is to make sure that we can type inside of the name input, the email input, and then click on the submit button. And whenever we do that, we should call the onUserAdd callback with the information out of the form. If you do not remember what onUserAdd is, that's totally fine. Let me give you a quick reminder. When we made the user form component inside of userform.js, we expect this component to receive a prop called onUserAdd. When the form is submitted, onUserAdd gets called with the name and the email out of the form inside of an object. This is a huge core component or core interaction inside of our component. So we really want to make sure we have a test around this to make sure the form submission process is definitely working as expected. That's why we are adding in a test around it. All right, so let's open up user form test.js. At the bottom of this file, I'm going to add in a new test with a description of it calls on user add when the form is submitted. Now, just so you know, I'm going to put a comment in here right away, and I'm going to say, not the best implementation. So we're going to write out a version of this test that is maybe not the best way of doing things. I'm then going to write out the test, we're going to put it all together, and it's going to work. The test is going to work as expected. We'll then take a break. We'll then discuss exactly why this isn't the best implementation, and then we're going to fix everything up. Part of testing is not only knowing what to test, but also the best way to do the test. And so that's what I really want you to understand here. I want you to understand there's many different ways we can do this, but one way is possibly a little bit better than the others. All right, in addition to that comment, I'm also going to add in a couple of other comments just to guide myself and describe what I'm trying to do in my test step by step. So first, I'm going to try to render my component. I'm then going to find the two inputs. I'm going to simulate typing in a name, simulate typing in an email. I'll then find the button, simulate clicking the button to submit the form, and then I'll write out an assertion to make sure on user add, that's the name, gets called with email and the name. So that's it. That's what we're going to try to do inside this test. Well, let's get started right away on step number 1. So we're going to try to render our component the exact same way we did previously. I will call render and put in user form. Next, I'm going to add in some code that's going to find those 2 text inputs. We can do this the same way we did it up here with that get all by role. Get all in particular, notice how this one is called get all, the other is get by role. Get all is going to try to find multiple different elements that have a role of text box. Get by role is going to find only just one. If get by role ever finds 0 elements or more than 1, it's going to throw an error. So we most often use get by role when we expect to find exactly 1 element with a given role. All right, to find the 2 text inputs, I'll get my inputs, the screen, get all by role, and I'm looking for elements with the role of text box, because that is the implicit role that is assigned to all input elements that do not have a type, or elements that or inputs that have a type of text. Once we find those 2 inputs, we then want to simulate typing in a name to the first one and an email to the second. So I'm going to do a little bit of destructuring here because I want to get a reference to the first input and the second one. So I'm going to replace inputs with square brackets and then destructure. I'll call the first one name input and the second email input.
Okay.
Next up, we need to simulate typing inside of the first input. To simulate typing, we're going to use a library that we already imported into this file at the top, the user event library. When we import the user event library, we get an object called user. This object has a couple of functions tied to it that allow us to simulate very common user events, such as clicking and typing. The 2 most important functions we're going to use off that library are user.click and user.keyboard. User.click is going to simulate a click event, clicking on some particular element that we provide as the first argument. We're going to call user.keyboard and then put in a string anytime that we want to simulate typing some string. And if we ever need to simulate pressing a control character, such as the command key or the enter key, arrow keys, and so on, we'll put in the name of the key and surround it by curly braces. So for example, user.keyboard, curly braces enter is going to simulate pressing the enter key. So in our case, we want to simulate first clicking on the input because we need to focus it, and then we're going to attempt to type in it by calling keyboard. So we'll put in user.click on the name input, and then user.keyboard, and I'll enter in a name of Jane. I'm then going to repeat the same process on the email one. So email input, user, keyboard, there we go, jane@jane.com. Just some random email. That totally works. Okay, this is looking good so far, but rather than have this video go on too long, quick pause and we'll finish up the test in just a moment. Let's start to wrap up this test. The first thing we have to do is find the button inside the form. We can find the button by using some code very similar to what we did on the last test. So we can use screen get by role and look for some element that has an ARIA role of button. That should give us the button inside the form. Okay, back down here, we'll say button is screen get by role button. We're then going to simulate clicking on that button, which should trigger a form submission. We can simulate clicking on that button with a user.click on button. There we go. Now we still have to write out an assertion, but before we do, I would like to save this file, try to run our tests, and just make sure that we're kind of on the right path for right now. So I'm going to save the file, go back over to my terminal. And as soon as I do so, you'll notice that we have 2 tests failing. That means that the test we just wrote out is probably failing, and we probably still have a failure from that app test.js file. And right now, these errors are really hard to read. There's like a ton of feedback here, and I just have a hard time, honestly, trying to figure out what is going on. So I would like to try to run just one test file right now. I do not want to run the app test file because it's just making interpreting this feedback here really, really challenging. Running our tests is the Jest testing framework. Jest has the ability to run just one single test file at a time. We can run a single test file by running our test with npm run test and then pressing W on our keyboard. You'll notice there is a message down here that says press W to show more. So I'm going to press W, and then it'll say, okay, press one additional key. In this case, I'm going to press P, which allows me to filter which test files I run based upon their name. So I'm going to press P on my keyboard, and now I can enter in the name of the test file I want to run. I'm going to type out user form, and I'll be told that if I use this as kind of a filter, I'm going to only run the user form test.js file, and I will not run the tests inside of app test.js. So I'm going to press enter, and now I'm running only the tests out of user form. So it's going to be a lot easier for us to understand why our test is failing, because we are not seeing all the output from that other failing test inside of app test.js. Now, Since we've done the filtering, we can actually scroll up a little bit and get a better sense of why the test is not passing, or why it's even throwing an error right now. So scrolling back up to the top, we'll see that right now, whenever we attempt to submit the form, we get an error message of onUserAdd is not a function. So what's going on here? Well, remember, this is a really important thing to keep in mind. Inside of our tests, we are rendering just the user form component. There is no app component. It's not being tested right now. So we are taking just this component by itself, we're attempting to run it, and we're attempting to type in it and clicking on it, and so on. Right now, whenever we render user form, we are not passing in any props to it whatsoever. No props. So inside of user form, whenever we render this thing, it is not being given an onUserAdd prop. We did not provide one. So when we simulate submitting the form, handle submit is called, but there is no function called onUserAdd. We did not provide it. So onUserAdd is essentially undefined. And that's why we are seeing an error message whenever we run our test right now. So we need to fix this up. One way we can fix this up is by going back over to our test and putting in right here onUserAdd and then an empty arrow function. If we do this, so if we save it and flip back over to our terminal, now our test is going to pass, because whenever we simulate submitting the form, there is a onUserAdd prop, there is a function there that can be called. Now this definitely makes the error go away, but there's a little bit of a problem. Remember, the entire goal of this test is to make sure that the onUserAdd function gets called, and to make sure that it gets called with the correct email and name. So we need to somehow provide a function right here where we can somehow verify that it gets called, and on top of that, make sure that it gets called with the correct arguments. Let me show you one possible way of doing this. And it's not really the best way, but it's going to kind of work for right now. Remember, this is not the best implementation, so we're going to fix this up and put in something better in just a moment. Right above our render call, I'm going to define a new function called callback. Whenever this function is called, I'm going to receive all the arguments that it gets called with by putting in ... args. I'm then going to define an array right above called arg list. Whenever callback gets called, I'm going to take the arguments that was provided and I'm going to push them into arg list. So we can do that with an arg list .push args, like so. So if you look at callback, this function really just records what it gets called with, it stores them in that array, and that's all it does. It really doesn't do anything else. I'm then going to take that and provide it to onUserAdd. So now what does this really do for us? Well, now whenever we try to submit our form, we should be able to take a look at arg list and see inside there the list of arguments that onUserAdd or our function was provided. So we can use arg list right here, we can use this array to verify that our callback function actually was called and that it was called with the appropriate email and password. Excuse me, email and name. I keep saying email and password. We want to make sure it gets called the appropriate email and name. So here's one way we could do that. We could write out expect arg list to have length 1. So that's going to make sure that our callback function got called at least one time. We could also make sure that the arg list, where we're storing all those different arguments, has the correct email and name. So we might do something like expect arg list at 0 at 0. I'll show you why we need the 2 there in just a moment. We want to make sure that that equals name of Jane and email of jane@jane.com. I'm picking specifically name of Jane and jane@jane.com because that is what I typed into the 2 inputs up here. Now let's save this and see if our test is passing. So if I flip back over, the test is passing. So that means that I am correctly verifying, in theory, that the onUserAdd callback is getting called and that it's being called with the correct email and name. I can really easily verify to make sure the test is working correctly if I change maybe the name right here. So if I put in a name of ASDF or something like that, save this, flip back over again, I'll see an error message. So I expected, my test is checking to see for that gibberish right there, but it was actually Jane that was received. So this is kind of proof that the test is working correctly. Okay, so the test right now, once again, it works, but things are not the best. So we're going to come back through, I'm going to point out some big issues with our test, and then we're going to start to fix these issues one by one. And again,
Okay, guys, so I'm feeling very sleepy and I need to get a cup of coffee, and yeah, I'll start this streaming again in like 10 minutes. So sorry about that, I'm ending this, but I'll once I come back, I'll try to implement this by my own. Looks interesting, and let's do it once I come back. I'm really sorry, I was literally about to sleep in the streaming itself. Okay, so over and out.